Hello, my name is Dr. Ross Baldick. I'm an emeritus professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. I would like to present about the role of sector coupling in renewable integration. If you happen to have any questions about this material, please feel free to send me an email, baldick@ece.utexas.edu. First, an outline. I want to mention in a few words traditional planning and operation of the electricity system, which will bring us to sector coupling and a fundamental question: why care about sector coupling? I want to explain that in terms of fuel endowments and what I call temporal fuel endowments. And I want to finish with some ideas about adaptations to temporal endowments as a path to deep decarbonization. So, traditional planning and operation of electricity. How do we do it? We forecast the electric demand, particularly the peak. That's based on economic trends, known major new consumers, and we build generation capacity to meet that peak and procure fuels to provide the energy. The dependence is mostly one way. The peak demand implies a generation capacity and a need for fuel. And there's some moderation of the peak through demand response programs, including very traditional techniques such as off-peak water heating. This mostly one-way dependence is a little bit surprising because electricity is the most volatile of all commodities. That is to say, the prices go up and down very rapidly. And the driver of this is the lack of cheap storage combined with relatively inflexible timing of demand. And until recently, until oil prices or oil futures went negative, electricity was the only commodity that exhibited negative prices. In essentially all other commodities, the demand and the timing of the demand would be modulated by supply conditions and resulting prices. Let me give a very simple example. If bananas are expensive, I happen to like fruit, I'll buy more apples. On the other hand, I might fill my gasoline tank during the week to avoid weekend prices if they happen to be higher than weekday prices. So we could say there is a coupling of the demand side to the supply, particularly through the prices. Typical supply chains also have coupling between stages of production with price elasticity, that is to say, demand is adjusted as prices change, and also substitution. Other products can be substituted for a product that's expensive. But electricity has historically been different. Historically, there have been few substitutes for electricity, so the demand was inelastic and it had relatively inflexible timing. I'm really just not going to wash my clothes at 3 a.m. no matter how cheap the electricity is at that time. Well, why should we care about sector coupling, particularly in the context of electricity? There's two big reasons. One is the increased use of natural gas for electricity. And because in some regions, for example, in New England in the US, there are gas pipeline capacity constraints. In other places, the east coast of Australia, for example, there are binding production constraints and high prices of available supply. The second reason is that renewables result in greater variation in the net load. What do I mean by that? The load minus the photovoltaic or PV, wind, and run-of-the-river hydro production. There's more variation in net load than the variation in load. In some regions, the thermal generation capacity that needs to make up for that is insufficiently flexible. Where we have gas, that tends to be more flexible than coal, so it tends to be used. And when that interacts with pipeline capacity constraints, we have a complexity in matching supply to demand. So if there was enough flexible generation without fuel limitations, and one more thing in the mix, without carbon concerns, we'd still build to meet the peak and procure fuel. We'd typically use more gas. And we wouldn't really be bothering to talk about sector coupling on the supply side or even the demand side. But increased variability of net load, that's due to the renewables, together with emissions goals, meaning we want to use more renewables, are forcing us to pay attention to sector coupling. Unfortunately, the demand side has historically been decoupled from the electricity industry by design. Most retail customers still see flat rates, And those rates are not mostly determined by fluctuating energy prices, but rather there's a significant contribution by typically volumetric adders for transmission and distribution costs and other issues. My point is we need to start thinking about coupling demand to supply. To understand that a little bit better, I want to introduce a topic which I'll call the fuel endowment. The fuel endowment significantly guides the generation choices. For example, Texas historically used coal, gas, and nuclear, with recent use of fracking increasing the gas supply and therefore the contribution of gas. But Texas has a flat terrain, so there's very little hydro. Australia, on the other hand, historically was predominantly coal with some hydro. Stored energy in fossil and nuclear fuel endowments and reservoir hydro with water endowments allowed relatively unfettered temporal distribution of consumption, given that we built enough generation capacity. Wind and solar endowments have not only the character of a geographical endowment, they're prevalent in some places and not others, but they also have a temporal character. And I'd like to propose that we need to consider coupling the consumption decisions to time-varying production through demand response. Well, before we get to that, what about storage, particularly batteries? Current uses of utility-scale chemical battery storage are primarily aimed at providing ancillary services or smoothing short-term fluctuations in renewable production. So we might ask, will we just build more and more batteries? Is large-scale battery storage the answer to managing all of the time-varying production of renewables? Well, I don't think so, because at near future prices of $100 a kilowatt hour for capacity, of battery capacity, and around 5,000 round trip cycles, we end up costing $20 per megawatt hour of energy stored, just the cost of the battery. In other words, the round-trip capital cost of storage is nearly as high as the average ERCOT wholesale price of electricity. ERCOT is the market in Texas, and those prices are about $30 a megawatt hour on average. So storing most energy in batteries would significantly increase overall costs, from today's costs of around $30, $35 a megawatt hour to, say, upwards of $50 to $55. Well, of course, prices are going down, but despite continued decreases in chemical battery storage, they're currently far too expensive to fully support decarbonization. There is a role, for example, the Tesla virtual power plant demonstrates a role for storing some energy, although it's currently dependent on federal and state subsidies. The bottom line is that the temporal variability of wind and solar are challenging the ability to meet electric load in several regions. The mismatch between PV production, for example, and electric load is especially significant for California. And the California ISO even coined the term duck curve to describe the shape of the state's net load. And in particular, on a mild sunny day, the net load falls so low that other generation cannot follow it down, and their net load rises rapidly again in the evening as the sun goes down. This is a picture of the duck curve. It more or less looks like a duck, and it's also becoming problematic in Australia and is likely to be problematic wherever there is considerable uncontrolled rooftop solar, which is an issue in many, many countries. In Texas, this is not so problematic. So different regions have historically adapted by using their energy endowment of fuel that underpin my examples of Texas and Australia, for example, and other places similarly use the fuels that are available to them. I would observe that similarly, increasing renewables are going to necessitate adapting to the temporal endowment. We need to couple consumption more strongly to renewable supply through demand response and flexible demand options. To do that, we need to think about the temporal endowments of wind and solar, which are different. Inland wind, for example, in several regions is strongest at night and during the autumn, winter, and spring. Nearshore wind is typically strongest in the afternoon, particularly in summer. On the other hand, solar coincides with the solar day, but modulated by cloud cover. Significant further increases in renewable penetration must confront that temporal endowment and adapt to it. And so what can we do? On the supply side, we can build shares of inland and nearshore wind and solar capacity to better match typical load shape peaks, particularly in the peak season. We can build or utilize more agile thermal capacity to provide for the net load. This is typically going to be gas where it's available. We can use some storage, and we can, when necessary, spill some renewables. There are also demand-side adaptations, and that's a key, I believe, to really getting to deep decarbonization. More and how to do that, we need to see retail tariffs that expose retail customers to wholesale prices, or at least more greatly expose that. We could also see more active demand-side modulation through agreements between retailers and customers. And I believe we're going to need more end-use storage of products and services to adapt to the temporal endowment. So the first example is actually in place for many commercial and industrial customers, and they're exposed to wholesale prices and indeed respond to what they perceive as potentially high prices. Having said that, the main demand response in the Texas region is still due to the setting of transmission prices. There have also been some bad experiences, for example, with Griddy, which is a retailer in Texas, Griddy real-time tariffs in the summer of 2019. Perhaps a more practical arrangement is to let customers allow the retailer to continue its historical role in hedging against wholesale price fluctuations, but then to have innovative arrangements that increase sector coupling. So a particular example is there's a retailer in Texas called Enchanted Rock that has installed generators in supermarkets that provide backup during outages. They also generate in non-outage conditions when the wholesale prices are high. In other words, they're on the customer side, but help to match supply to demand. Well, such distributed thermal generation probably has unclear implications for decarbonization, but I think other retailer customer arrangements are possible that don't involve distributed generation. Again, I'll emphasize the role of end-use storage of a product or service. One example is off-peak water heating. It's a traditional example. Another one is slow electric vehicle charging at night in regions with inland wind and during the day for regions with solar. Another approach is air conditioning pre-cooling that better aligns daily demand variation with solar production. So in Texas, for example, inland wind peaks in the middle of the night, so that makes sense for at-home charging of electric vehicles. As we get more photovoltaic in Texas, but also in regions with plenty of photovoltaics, electric vehicle charging during the day, but completed well before sundown, probably makes sense. Turning to AC pre-cooling, we can think about using AC pre-cooling in air conditioning regions to better align consumption in summer, where peaks typically occur, with solar production. The idea is that we can modulate the air conditioning consumption. It's a significant contribution currently to the net load after the sun goes down, but the idea is that we could cool the house earlier in the day during the peak of solar irradiance. That will tend to reduce exports from rooftop solar to the electric distribution system. It can help with the ramping of net load, and it can reduce the peak of net load. Of course, it doesn't come for free. Pre-cooling results in higher energy consumption overall. This is a bit like round trip losses in a battery. But we don't have to buy a battery. We just have to adjust our thermostat. Here's a schematic idea. The blue curve shows a typical duck curve based on Texas data. The red curve suggests how pre-cooling can help. Consumption is brought forward into the middle of the day, making it higher in the middle of the day, but that reduces it after the sun goes down. Well, that means that consumers will use more electricity, so one has to ask, won't they balk at spending more money? Well, time of use and other real-time rates will tend to be lower during times of excess solar. So that means that it can be overall cheaper to bring your consumption forward to cheaper times under these new time of use rates. There are a number of higher effort end-use storage techniques as well. For example, we can have chillers and dedicated cool storage for air conditioning. We can also utilize chemical processes such as air separation that store oxygen and nitrogen, and we can make it when the prices are low and use it, store it, and use it later. There are other industrial demand response examples. And there are even more radical uses of demand following supply, such as water pumping, where we can deliberately change the consumption based on renewable production. So to conclude, foreseeable levels of battery storage will be insufficient to cost effectively fully support decarbonization. There are no other storage options in regions such as Texas. Sector coupling can facilitate renewable integration, and I've demonstrated several examples on the demand side that can utilize end-use storage to adapt to the temporal environment.